Most people would say a pro wrestler entering the UFC would get destroyed, and usually they would be right. But Brock Lesnar wasn't just any pro wrestler. Lesnar was a man who dominated the world of scripted wrestling and then went on to become one of the most feared heavyweights in UFC history. In November 2008, just 9 months after his UFC debut and in only his 4th professional fight, Lesnar shocked the world by becoming the UFC heavyweight champion. This is the story of the WWE superstar who became the baddest man on the planet.
What's incredible with Brock is that Brock went from pro wrestling to being the UFC heavyweight champion. Did so with such a short amount of time of training in MMA. I mean, obviously he had a spectacular amateur wrestling career. He was a legit top flight amateur wrestler and a fucking genetic freak. But to be able to make that transition, winning the fucking world title against a guy like Randy Couture, like what that guy did is nothing short of insanity. Like no one's ever done that before.
Let's rewind a bit. Before the WWE, before the UFC, Brock Lesnar was just a kid from Webster, South Dakota, a small town farm boy. Sounds pretty far from the world of big money fighting, right? But don't be fooled, this was a guy who was born with some serious athletic talent. We are talking about strength that made him almost inhuman, even at a young age.
His bone structure is just straight Viking.
Yeah.
He's just not a normal human. I mean, his head is way too big, his body's way too big, his hands are too big. He's a guy who's cutting weight to get down to the 265-pound weight limit. He's an enormous human being, and he's skillful. I mean, the advantages that he has, like the horsepower advantages over the average person, are so substantial that he's a real threat. Even at today, like, what is he, 37, 36, 37 years old?
Yeah.
From the start, Lesnar was no stranger to hard work. Growing up on a farm meant lifting heavy things, physical labor, and an unyielding work ethic. But it wasn't just brute strength that made Brock special. This guy had freakish athleticism. You'd look at him and think, this kid's built like a brick wall. And it was that natural power that helped him rise to the top in every sport he tried. In high school, Brock was a beast on the wrestling mat. And I'm not just talking about the kind of wrestling you do at a weekend barbecue to impress your buddies. We're talking about hardcore, legitimate wrestling. His senior year, he went undefeated in high school. Yeah, undefeated. He then took that talent to the University of Minnesota, where he dominated the NCAA scene. And let me tell you, this wasn't some soft walk in the park. In 2000, Brock won the NCAA Division I Heavyweight Championship. That is the big leagues of college wrestling. He was the guy in collegiate wrestling, and anyone who got in his way quickly learned that they were outmatched.
He's the biggest genetic freak I've ever seen in the sport. You ever see his NFL combine numbers? He had like legit top flight combine numbers, like ridiculous numbers. Just a freak, man. Like a real rare one. Very fast too. Like his run was fast. Look at this. 6'3", weighs 283 pounds, a 40-yard dash of 4'7". 4'7" at 283 pounds. Jumped 35 inches vertically and 10 feet from the standing long jump. He's hurling almost 300 pounds, 10 feet. He can bench 225 pounds for 30 reps. 225 for 30 reps.
That's crazy.
Dude.
So naturally, after that, everyone thought, okay, this guy is special, but what is next for him? Vince McMahon saw Brock and thought, that's my next big thing. In March 2002, Lesnar debuted on WWE's main roster. By August of that same year, at just 25 years old, he defeated The Rock to become the youngest WWE champion in history. And that was literally his moniker. He was a force. His raw power, athleticism, and undeniable charisma turned him into a household name almost overnight. Lesnar wasn't just another meathead. He was an absolute monster, and WWE fans ate it up. He quickly became one of the most popular and controversial figures in the company. But just as quickly as he rose, he made the bold decision to leave it all behind. Yeah, you heard that right. Lesnar, at the peak of his WWE success, walked away from it all. In March 2004, after just 2 years at the top of the WWE, Lesnar stunned everyone by leaving. The grueling 300-plus day-a-year travel schedule had taken its toll. Now, at the time, it seemed crazy. Why would someone leave all that fame and fortune to pursue something else? He was at the top of the wrestling world, yet he walked away with no clear plan in mind. He just knew he couldn't handle the WWE hectic work schedule at that time. So, what did he end up doing? He started training in MMA. By 2006, Lesnar had started his MMA training. In June 2007, he won his first MMA fight in K1. By February 2008, he was making his UFC debut against Frank Mir. Here's the thing. Transitioning from the WWE to the UFC isn't just jumping from one sport to another. It's like stepping into a whole new universe. In the WWE, it's entertainment. Sure, you have to be athletic, strong, and put on a good show, but at the end of the day, it's a performance. The UFC, on the other hand, that is as real as it gets. It's raw, it's brutal. It is two people locked in a cage trying to knock each other out or make the other guy tap. And for Brock Lesnar, the critics weren't just skeptical, they were savage. When Brock signed his UFC contract in 2007, it was all over the headlines. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others said that he would get wrecked. Thing about it, Brock was stepping into a world where guys like Randy Couture, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, and Mirko Cro Cop were legends. These were fighters who had been training their whole lives in disciplines like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, and wrestling. And Brock? Sure, he was an NCAA champion, but to the MMA community, he was just that WWE guy.
Champion was just this remarkably fast career. Somewhere along the way, we hear that this Brock Lesnar is going to end up in MMA. How's he going to do? What skills does he have? Is he taking this serious? Sure, all those questions were around. Generally, though, you would use, when somebody was in that environment and having those questions, you would use that to dismiss them. It wasn't like that with Brock, because there's just something special about Brock.
The doubters were loud. Fighters and the UFC openly mocked him. Fans flooded forums and social media calling him a poser. Dana White, the UFC president, defended the decision, saying Brock was a freak athlete with untapped potential. But even Dana admitted there was a risk. And let's not forget the stakes here. Brock wasn't starting in some small regional MMA promotion like most fighters do. No, he dove straight into the deep end of the UFC, where the competition is unforgiving. His debut fight? Against Frank Mir, a former heavyweight champion and submission wizard. If you were scripting a worst-case scenario for Lesnar, this was it. But here's what most people didn't realize. Brock wasn't coming to the UFC for a paycheck or to prove a point. He came to win. This guy had a chip on his shoulder the size of Minnesota. He trained like a man possessed, sharpening his striking, learning submission defense, and building his cardio to match his insane physical gifts. Brock wasn't just bringing size and strength to the cage, he was bringing an unrelenting will to prove the haters wrong. The night finally arrived. UFC 81, Lesnar versus Mir. The arena was electric, but the vibe wasn't exactly in Brock's favor. Most fans were there to watch him fail. And the fight? Oh man, it started with a bang. Lesnar came out like a freight train, blitzing Mir with punches and using his wrestling to take him down. For a moment, it looked like the critics might have to eat their words. But then, in classic Frank Mir fashion, he locked up a knee bar out of nowhere. Brock tapped, and just like that, the dream debut was over. Yeah, it wasn't the fairy tale that Lesnar hoped for. The MMA world had its I told you so moment, but Brock wasn't deterred. He treated that loss like a learning experience. If anything, it fueled him. The doubters weren't silenced yet, but Brock was just getting started. After the loss to Frank Mir, Brock could have packed his bags and called it a day. Plenty of guys would have, but not Brock. For him, that fight wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. He took it as a wake-up call, and instead of sulking, he went back to work. But let me tell you, Brock Lesnar in grind mode, that is a scary sight. Brock started training like his life depended on it. He worked on his striking, which, let's be real, wasn't great in his debut. He brought in top-level coaches to fine-tune his boxing and kickboxing. And his wrestling? Well, he doubled down on what he already did best, taking people down and smashing them. Brock's size and power were undeniable, but now he has started to add technique to the mix. For his second fight in the UFC and his third MMA fight overall, Brock faced Heath Herring. Now, Herring wasn't some pushover. He was a veteran of Pride FC and had fought some of the toughest heavyweights in the world. But Brock made Herring look like a rookie. From the opening bell, Lesnar landed a thunderous right hand that sent Herring flying backward. And from there, it was a 3-round clinic. Brock used his wrestling to dominate, controlling Herring on the ground and pounding him relentlessly. This win was a statement. Lesnar wasn't just some WWE guy trying his luck anymore. He was a legitimate threat in the heavyweight division. And if you thought he was done, oh no, the best was yet to come. At UFC 91, November 15, 2008, Lesnar faced Randy Couture for the heavyweight title. In just his 4th professional fight, Lesnar was challenging for UFC gold. Once again, the critics doubted him. Randy was the ultimate technician, a guy who had faced giants before and beaten them. But Lesnar wasn't like anyone Couture had fought. He was bigger, faster, and hungrier. The fight was competitive at first, with Couture using his experience to keep things close. But then, in the second round, Lesnar landed a bomb of a right hand that dropped Couture. A few hammer fists later, and that was all she wrote. Brock Lesnar was the UFC heavyweight champion. Now think about that for a second. In just his 4th professional fight, Brock Lesnar became the champion of the most dangerous division in the UFC. Let that sink in. Now let's talk about some of the key moments that defined Brock's UFC career, because trust me, there were plenty. First up, the rematch with Frank Mir at UFC 100 on July 11, 2009. This one was personal. After that first loss, Brock wanted nothing more than to shut Mir up. And boy did he. From the opening bell, Lesnar took Mir down and unleashed a ground and pound clinic. It was brutal. By the time the ref stopped the fight, Mir's face was a mess. And Lesnar, he was on top of the cage screaming at the crowd. That is when Brock delivered his now famous post-fight rant.
I'm gonna drink a Coors Light. That's a Coors Light because Bud Light won't pay me nothing.
Classic Brock. Love him or hate him, the guy knew how to put on a show.
His speech after with the Coors Light and Bud Light and the whole thing there.
I liked the speech afterwards. I thought that it was definitely home to his demographic.
Then there was UFC 116 on July 3rd, 2010 against Shane Carwin. The fight was insane. Carwin was undefeated and his power was ridiculous. In the first round, it looked like Brock was done. Carwin hit him with everything but the kitchen sink. But somehow Brock survived. And in the second round, he turned the tables, taking Carwin down and submitting him with an arm triangle choke. It was a performance that showed Brock's heart and toughness. But Brock's UFC career wasn't just about battles in the octagon. He had to fight his own body too. In 2009, Lesnar was diagnosed with diverticulitis, a condition that causes severe inflammation in the intestines. It was brutal. Brock lost weight, strength, and stamina. He was forced to undergo surgery, and for a while it looked like his fighting days might be over. But in true Brock fashion, he refused to quit. He came back, fought Cain Velasquez, and later Alistair Overeem. Sure, those fights didn't go his way, but the fact that he even stepped into the cage after what he went through, that says everything you need to know about his character. Lesnar lost his title to Cain Velasquez in October 2010 at UFC 121, and his final UFC fight came in December 2011 against Alistair Overeem. After those fights, he left the UFC, but the story didn't end there. Not even close. In fact, Brock didn't exactly retire, he just decided to take his freakish talents elsewhere. And that place? The WWE. After stepping away from UFC competition in 2011, Brock made a massive return to WWE in 2012. He wasn't done with the limelight yet, and in typical Lesnar fashion, he went straight for the top. Brock made an immediate impact by obliterating Cena, proving that even after a few years away, he was still every bit the monster he was before. But the real story started in 2014, when Brock Lesnar made history by ending The Undertaker's legendary undefeated streak at WrestleMania 30. Yep, you heard that right. Even if you weren't a wrestling fan, you knew what the WrestleMania streak was, and Brock was the guy to break it. The crowd at the Superdome was absolutely stunned when the 3 count hit. No one expected it, and it was a shocking, defining moment in WWE history.
It's over.
And that wasn't all. Lesnar went on to dominate WWE as the Universal Champion, winning the title in 2017 by defeating Goldberg at WrestleMania 33, in a match that was short but absolutely brutal. This was Brock at his most physically dominating. He didn't need to put on 5-star matches, he just needed to show up and destroy whoever was put in front of him. What made Brock different from everyone else in WWE was the fact that he wasn't a full-time wrestler. Lesnar had a unique contract where he didn't appear at every show. He didn't have to. When he showed up, it was a spectacle. He was a marquee match and WWE knew it. Brock didn't need to grind it out week after week like other superstars. He made each appearance a huge event. But even though Brock had his hands full in WWE, there was always one thing hanging over his head: unfinished business in the UFC. Fast forward to 2016, Brock Lesnar's name still loomed large in the UFC, and the fans wanted to see him return. It seemed like UFC president Dana White couldn't stop teasing Brock's possible return to MMA. Then, at UFC 200, the impossible happened. Brock Lesnar announced he was coming back. At the age of 38, after 5 years away from the octagon, Lesnar was set to face Mark Hunt, a hard-hitting striker known for his knockout power.
What does that mean?
I think that means that Brock Lesnar is back.
Is that real?
That's real. That's
Who's
as
he
real as
fighting?
it gets.
I'm just finding this out.
Doesn't matter.
I'm upset. Who's he fighting?
I don't know.
Well, we have to have an opponent to talk about it.
Well, not really. Let's talk about Brock Lesnar.
Now, if you were expecting Brock to stroll back into the UFC and just get blown out, you were sorely mistaken. Lesnar came into the UFC with a vengeance. In front of a sold-out crowd, he looked like he hadn't missed a beat. Sure, he hadn't fought in half a decade, but he dominated Hunt. Brock used his wrestling and ground and pound to neutralize Hunt, winning a unanimous decision in a fight that cemented his place as a true force in both sports. But of course, this being Brock Lesnar, things weren't as simple as it seemed. After the fight, it came to light that Lesnar had tested positive for a banned substance, and as a result, his win was overturned, and he was handed a temporary suspension by USADA. Even with that bump in the road, Brock's performance at UFC 200 still proved that he had plenty left in the tank. After UFC 200, Brock continued to flirt with the idea of a UFC return. He called out former light heavyweight and heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier in 2018 after Cormier's stunning win over Stipe Miocic at UFC 226, where Cormier became the second fighter after Conor McGregor to hold 2 championships simultaneously. Brock was there at ringside, taunting Cormier, and the UFC world went crazy.
Let me tell you something. I walked into this building and watched the heavyweight disasters from the beginning. Miocic, the piece of DC, I'm coming for you.
There was talk, real talk. Brock could step back into the octagon and challenge for the title. Imagine that, Brock Lesnar versus Daniel Cormier for the UFC Heavyweight Championship. That fight would have been massive, one of the biggest in UFC history, no doubt. It would have been a true clash of styles. Cormier's all-around MMA game versus Brock's size, strength, and wrestling. Unfortunately, that fight never happened. Brock's UFC career was essentially put on hold as WWE continued to keep him busy as one of the top stars in the company. But for a moment there, we thought we might see a UFC mega fight once again. So, what is the takeaway here? Brock Lesnar somehow has managed to stay relevant and a huge draw in both the UFC and WWE. This guy is the definition of a crossover star. He is the rare athlete who has managed to dominate in two of the most physically demanding sports in the world. Not many people can say that they've done that. You can count on one hand the number of athletes who have made the jump from wrestling to MMA and came out on top. Brock Lesnar is in that exclusive club. And just when you thought he was done, he kept coming back bigger and better. As we look back at Brock's legacy, we can't help but be amazed by what he's achieved. He may have started in the WWE, then made a name for himself in the UFC, but it's his ability to transcend both worlds that sets him apart. Whether it was headlining major WrestleManias or returning to the UFC for a brief but electrifying moment, Brock Lesnar has solidified himself as one of the most enduring and successful athletes in combat sports history.